June 1945, Okinawa. Japanese infantry had spent months preparing defensive positions against American bolt-action rifles and Tommy guns. But nothing could have prepared them for the moment when GIs opened up with a weapon that looked like a simple carbine, but unleashed devastating full-automatic fire at 750 rounds per minute. In seconds, entire squads were pinned down by what appeared to be just another American support weapon, shattering their tactical assumptions about enemy firepower. But how did a light rifle designed for rear-echelon troops become the weapon that made seasoned Japanese veterans question everything they knew about American small arms?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. June 1945 brought the final death throes of the Pacific War to the blood-soaked coral of Okinawa. The island stretched 80 miles long and 18 miles wide, a stepping stone that both sides knew would determine the fate of Japan itself. For 3 months, the battle had raged across every ridge, cave, and sugarcane field. The Japanese knew this was their last chance to show the Americans that invading the home islands would cost too much blood to be worth the price. Emperor Hirohito still sat on his throne in Tokyo, though his divine empire was crumbling around him like old paper in the rain. Japanese factories could barely produce bullets, let alone the rifles to fire them. Steel was so scarce that many soldiers carried bamboo spears as backup weapons. Rice rations had been cut so many times that a full meal was just a memory. Yet the emperor's voice still echoed in every soldier's mind, commanding them to die rather than surrender. Death before dishonor was not just a saying, but a sacred promise carved into their souls since childhood. On the southern end of Okinawa, Sergeant Kenji Tanaka crouched in a limestone cave that had been carved into a perfect firing position. The cave was 8 feet deep and 4 feet high, just enough room for 3 men and their rifles. Tanaka had been a soldier for 6 years, fighting first in China and then across the Pacific Islands as the American war machine pushed closer to Japan. At 28 years old, he was ancient by infantry standards. Most of the boys with him were 17 or 18, fresh from rice farms with barely 3 months of training. The cave overlooked a narrow valley where American troops would have to advance. Tanaka had helped dig similar positions for 2 weeks, creating an invisible maze of death that stretched for miles. Each cave was connected to the next by tunnels, allowing defenders to disappear and reappear like ghosts. The plan was simple and had worked on other islands. Let the Americans come close, then hit them with everything at once. Make them pay for every yard with blood.
Tanaka checked his Type 99 rifle for the 100th time that morning. The bolt moved smooth and clean. 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. Each bullet had to count because there were no more coming. His men carried the older Type 38 rifles, lighter weapons that fired smaller bullets. They were good rifles, proven in battle after battle. Japanese marksmen had used them to pick off American soldiers at ranges that amazed even their enemies. The Americans had their own weapons, of course. Tanaka had seen them in previous battles. The M1 Garand rifle was heavy but powerful, firing 8 shots before the famous ping sound that meant an empty clip. American soldiers also carried Thompson submachine guns, deadly up close but useless at long range. Some had the new grease gun, cheaper to make but just as limited. These were known quantities, weapons the Japanese had learned to fight against through bitter experience. What made the Americans dangerous was not their individual weapons, but their endless supply of ammunition, artillery, and air support. They could afford to spray bullets like water from a hose. Japanese soldiers had to make every shot count, because when their ammunition ran out, there was no more coming. This difference had shaped every battle strategy for the past year. Private Hiroshi Yamamoto, barely 19 and thin as a bamboo stalk, lay next to Tanaka with his Type 38 ready. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from hunger. None of them had eaten a full meal in days. The supply lines were cut, and American planes controlled the skies. But Yamamoto had grown up hearing stories of samurai warriors who fought on empty stomachs and won through pure spirit. His grandfather had served the emperor in the war against Russia 40 years earlier, carrying a rifle not much different from the one in his hands now. The third man in their cave was Corporal Satoshi Ito, 22 years old and steady as stone. He had survived Guadalcanal and Saipan, watching island after island fall to the American advance. Ito knew what was coming better than the younger men. He had seen American firepower up close and understood that individual courage, no matter how fierce, could not stop an entire industrial nation focused on war. But he also knew his duty. The emperor had not given permission to surrender, so surrender was not possible.
Outside their cave, the morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific. The sea stretched endlessly toward America, 3,000 miles of ocean that had not stopped the enemy fleet. Landing ships still crowded the beaches below, unloading supplies that seemed to have no end. Trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, and mountains of ammunition boxes created a mechanical landscape that impressed even the defenders. America seemed to have turned its entire country into a weapons factory.
In the distance, Tanaka could hear the rumble of American tanks moving up the coastal road. The sound was different from Japanese tanks, deeper and more powerful. Everything about the American military seemed bigger, louder, and more wasteful. They used 10 bullets where a Japanese soldier would use 1. They called in artillery strikes that lasted for hours, turning entire hillsides into moonscapes. It was not the Japanese way of war, but it was undeniably effective. The sound of small arms fire drifted up from the valley below. Not the sharp crack of rifles, but something different. Rapid, sustained bursts that seemed to go on forever. Tanaka frowned and adjusted his position to get a better view. American infantry was advancing through the sugarcane, but they were carrying weapons he had never seen before. They looked like rifles, but sounded like machine guns. The noise was wrong, all wrong, like nothing in his 6 years of combat experience. The first American squad moved into the open valley like they owned it. Tanaka counted 12 men spread out in a loose line, walking through the knee-high grass without much care for cover. They carried the usual mix of weapons he expected. Most had the long M1 Garand rifle slung across their backs. A few carried Thompson submachine guns with the round drum magazines. One man had what looked like a Browning automatic rifle, the heavy weapon that could lay down covering fire. But half the squad carried something different. At first glance, they looked like short rifles, maybe carbines for officers or support troops. They were much smaller than the Garand, with simple wooden stocks and plain metal receivers, nothing special about them at all. Tanaka had heard rumors about American carbines, light weapons given to truck drivers and radio operators who needed something better than a pistol but did not require a full battle rifle. The Americans stopped about 200 yards from the cave line, perfect range for the Type 99 rifles. Tanaka whispered to his men to wait for his signal. The plan was to let the entire squad get closer, then hit them all at once with precise, aimed fire. 3 Japanese marksmen with good rifles should be able to drop at least half the Americans before they could take cover. Then everything Tanaka knew about warfare changed in the span of 10 seconds. The lead American soldier raised one of the small carbines to his shoulder and pulled the trigger. Instead of the single sharp crack of a rifle shot, the weapon erupted in a continuous stream of fire that sounded like ripping cloth. Muzzle flashes flickered so fast they looked like a strobe light. The noise was incredible, a sustained roar that echoed off the limestone cliffs like thunder that would not stop. Bullets struck the rocks around Tanaka's cave in a steady stream, sending chips of stone flying in all directions. The impacts came so fast they sounded like hail on a tin roof. He pressed himself against the back wall of the cave, unable to believe what he was hearing. No rifle could fire that fast. Only machine guns made that kind of noise, and machine guns were big, heavy weapons that needed 2 or 3 men to operate. But this was just one American soldier with what looked like a simple carbine, firing more bullets in 5 seconds than a Japanese infantry squad could fire in a minute. The weapon seemed to have an endless supply of ammunition. When the first burst finally stopped, the soldier quickly changed magazines and was ready to fire again in seconds. Then the other Americans with the same weapons opened up.
4 carbines firing at once created a wall of sound that drowned out everything else on the battlefield. The volume of fire was beyond anything Tanaka had experienced even facing American machine gun nests on previous islands. Each weapon was putting out bullets at a rate that seemed impossible for such a small gun. Private Yamamoto tried to peek around the corner of their cave to get a shot, but immediately jerked back as bullets sparked off the rocks inches from his face. The Americans were not aiming carefully like Japanese soldiers would. They were simply spraying the entire cliff face with hundreds of rounds, making it impossible for the defenders to return fire. Young Yamamoto's eyes were wide with shock. In his 3 months of training, no one had told him about weapons like this. Japanese military doctrine was built around careful, aimed fire, making every shot count. Soldiers practiced for hours to hit targets at 300 yards with iron sights. The idea of wasting ammunition in wild automatic fire went against everything he had been taught about proper warfare. Corporal Ito crawled over to Tanaka, shouting to be heard over the constant gunfire. "What kind of weapon is that? It sounds like a light machine gun but looks like a rifle." His voice carried the confusion that all 3 men felt. Everything they knew about American small arms was being torn apart by the reality outside their cave. The fire slackened for a moment as the Americans reloaded. Tanaka risked a quick look and saw them inserting curved magazines that held far more ammunition than any rifle should carry. These were not the 8-round clips of the Garand or even the 20-round box magazines of the Browning automatic rifle. These magazines looked like they held 30 rounds or more, enough to sustain the incredible rate of fire he had just witnessed. The tactical implications hit him like a physical blow. Japanese infantry tactics relied on the fact that most American weapons were slow-firing rifles or short-range submachine guns. Trained marksmen with bolt-action rifles could pick off individual Americans during the long seconds between shots. But these new weapons eliminated that advantage completely. They could put out suppressing fire like machine guns while being carried by individual soldiers.
The Americans began moving forward again, but now their advance was completely different. Instead of walking carefully and taking cover when fired upon, they simply pointed their carbines at the cliff face and held down the triggers. The stream of bullets was so heavy that no Japanese soldier could expose himself long enough to aim and fire back. It was like trying to stick your head up into a waterfall of lead. One American soldier ran forward 50 yards while his teammates covered him with automatic fire. Then he dropped down and added his own weapon to the barrage while another man advanced. They were using fire and movement tactics that should have required machine guns and large squads, but doing it with weapons that looked like simple carbines. Tanaka realized that everything the Japanese high command thought they knew about American infantry weapons was wrong. These were not the limited, slow-firing rifles they had planned to fight against. This was something entirely new, a weapon that combined the portability of a rifle with the sustained firepower of a machine gun. If every American soldier carried one of these, the entire Japanese defensive strategy was useless.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sound of more automatic weapons echoed from other parts of the valley. This was not just one squad with experimental weapons. This was standard equipment, issued widely enough that multiple units were using them in the same attack. The Americans had not just improved their weapons, they had completely changed the nature of infantry combat, and the Japanese were facing it for the first time without any idea how to respond. The moment of complete understanding came when Tanaka saw the curved magazine fly through the air. An American soldier had emptied his 30-round magazine in less than 4 seconds of continuous fire, ejected it with a quick motion, and immediately slammed in a fresh one. The entire reload took no more than 3 seconds. Then the terrible ripping sound began again, another stream of bullets that made the limestone cave shake with impacts. Tanaka pressed his back against the stone wall and closed his eyes, trying to process what this meant. In his mind, he calculated the numbers that spelled doom for every Japanese position on the island. If each American soldier could fire 30 rounds in 4 seconds, reload in 3 seconds, and do it again and again, then a single squad could put out more firepower than an entire Japanese company with their bolt-action rifles. The mathematics of destruction became crystal clear. A Japanese soldier with a Type 99 rifle could fire maybe 15 aimed shots per minute if he was very good and very fast. These American carbines were firing at least 10 times that rate, maybe more. One American with this weapon could suppress an entire cave full of Japanese soldiers, keeping them pinned down while his teammates moved forward. It was not just a new gun, it was a complete revolution in how infantry battles would be fought. Young Yamamoto crawled over to Tanaka, his face pale with fear and confusion. "Sergeant, how can we fight against weapons like that? Every time I try to aim, the bullets are too thick to see through. It is like trying to shoot back at a storm cloud." His voice cracked with the weight of realization. Everything his instructors had taught him about marksmanship and individual courage seemed worthless against this wall of automatic fire. The sound outside changed as more American squads joined the attack. Now there were dozens of the automatic carbines firing at once, creating a continuous roar that made normal conversation impossible. The volume of fire was so intense that rocks were being pulverized into dust, filling the air with a fine powder that made breathing difficult. Tanaka had never experienced anything like it, not even during the massive artillery bombardments that preceded every American attack.
He thought about his training back in Japan, where instructors had taught him that American soldiers were wasteful with ammunition and relied too much on their industrial advantage instead of individual skill. Japanese soldiers were trained to be efficient, to make every shot count, to win through superior spirit and better marksmanship. But what good was marksmanship when the enemy could fire 100 bullets for every one you could aim? Corporal Ito managed to crawl close enough to shout in Tanaka's ear, "This is not the America we were told about. These are not the same weapons we fought against on other islands. Something has changed. They have given every soldier the firepower of a machine gun squad." His words carried the weight of a terrible discovery. The Japanese military had built their entire Pacific defense strategy around fighting the Americans they knew, not the Americans they were actually facing. The realization hit Tanaka like a physical blow to his stomach. If American factories could produce weapons like this in large numbers, then Japan had already lost the war. Not just this battle or this island, but the entire conflict. The Emperor's divine protection could not stop bullets fired at 750 rounds per minute. Individual courage could not overcome industrial capacity that could arm every soldier with what amounted to a portable machine gun. Through the dust and smoke, Tanaka caught glimpses of more American soldiers advancing up the slope. They moved with confidence now, knowing that their weapons could suppress any defensive position. They did not crawl on their bellies or dash desperately from cover to cover like soldiers facing rifle fire. They walked upright, spraying bursts from their carbines to keep the defenders pinned down while they closed the distance. The sound of voices speaking English grew closer. American soldiers were calling to each other, coordinating their advance in loud, casual tones. They were not whispering or trying to stay hidden. They knew the Japanese could not return effective fire against such overwhelming firepower. The confidence in their voices told Tanaka everything he needed to know about how the battle was going. In that moment, crouched in a limestone cave with bullets striking the walls around him faster than raindrops in a typhoon, Tanaka understood that everything the Japanese government had told its people about the war was a lie. America was not running out of resources or losing the will to fight. American factories were not just producing more of the same weapons, they were creating entirely new kinds of warfare that made Japanese tactics obsolete. He thought about the villages back home where families grew sweet potatoes because rice was too precious for civilians to eat. He thought about the factories where workers melted down cooking pots to make bullets that would never be enough. He thought about the bamboo spears that old men trained with because there was no steel left for real weapons. While Japan scraped together the last of its resources, America had been busy inventing the future of infantry combat. The weight of absolute defeat settled on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. Not just military defeat, but the collapse of everything he had believed about Japanese superiority, American weakness, and the divine protection of the emperor. How could the gods favor a nation whose soldiers could not even return fire against an enemy armed with weapons that seemed to come from another century? Private Yamamoto was crying now, not from fear, but from the crushing realization that they had been sent to fight a war that was already over. The tears mixed with limestone dust on his cheeks, leaving pale streaks that looked like war paint in reverse. Tanaka wanted to comfort the boy, to tell him that courage and honor still mattered, but the words would not come. How could he speak of honor when honor could not stop what was happening outside their cave? The sound of automatic fire grew even closer. Soon the Americans would be close enough to throw grenades into the cave positions. When that happened, the battle would be over, and Tanaka knew there would be no last glorious charge, no heroic death worthy of the emperor. There would just be the end. Quick and brutal and meaningless. Delivered by weapons that turned individual soldiers into one-man armies. The grenades came at sunset. 3 small green spheres that bounced off the cave walls before exploding with flashes that turned the world white. Tanaka felt the concussion slam against his chest like a giant fist. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. Through the smoke and dust, he saw Corporal Ito lying motionless near the cave entrance, blood pooling beneath his head. Private Yamamoto was curled against the back wall, alive, but staring at nothing with empty eyes. When the American voices grew loud enough to understand, Tanaka made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He dropped his Type 99 rifle and raised his hands above his head. The weight of 6 years of military training told him to fight to the death, but the reality of 30-round magazines firing at 750 rounds per minute told him that death would accomplish nothing except satisfying the honor code of a nation that had already lost the war. 2 American soldiers entered the cave with their carbines ready. Up close, Tanaka could see the weapons that had shattered his understanding of warfare. They were smaller than he had imagined, almost toy-like compared to the massive Garand rifles. But the curved magazines and the selector switches on the left side of the receivers told the real story. These were not the simple carbines he had expected. They were fully automatic weapons designed to give every American soldier the firepower of a machine gun team. The Americans were young, maybe 20 years old, with clean uniforms and well-fed faces that spoke of a nation that could afford to keep its soldiers healthy while waging war on the other side of the world. One of them spoke a few words of broken Japanese, asking if Tanaka was wounded. The kindness in his voice was almost harder to bear than the bullets had been. These were not the savage demons that Japanese propaganda had described. They were just boys with incredibly deadly weapons, doing a job that their country's factories had made almost easy. 3 months later, Tanaka found himself on a transport ship heading back toward Japan. The war had ended with 2 atomic bombs that made the M2 Carbine seem like a children's toy by comparison. Emperor Hirohito had surrendered in a radio broadcast that shattered the last illusions of divine protection and inevitable victory. Tanaka sat on the deck of the American Liberty ship, watching the Japanese coastline grow larger as they approached Yokohama Harbor. The Japan he saw from the ship's rail was not the Japan he had left 6 years earlier. American bombers had turned the major cities into wastelands of ash and rubble. Tokyo was a flat expanse of burned foundations stretching to the horizon. Yokohama's port facilities were twisted metal and broken concrete. The industrial might that was supposed to support the emperor's armies had been reduced to scrap iron and memories. But it was the people on the dock who showed Tanaka the true cost of the war. They were thin as scarecrows, dressed in patched clothing that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to identify.
Children stared at the American supply ships with hollow eyes, their faces carrying the weight of years spent hungry, while their fathers and brothers died on distant islands. These were the people who had been told that individual spirit could overcome American machines. These were the people who had paid the price for that lie. Tanaka walked through the ruins of his hometown, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and memories of weapons that could fire faster than thoughts. His family's house was gone, burned in one of the fire raids that had swept through the residential districts. His parents were living in a shack made from salvaged wood and corrugated metal, grateful to be alive in a world where survival was no longer guaranteed. Over rice and pickled vegetables, the first real meal his family had shared in months, Tanaka tried to explain what he had learned on Okinawa. He told them about American soldiers who carried enough firepower to stop an entire squad, about factories that could produce new types of weapons while fighting a war on two sides of the world, about a nation so wealthy that it could afford to waste ammunition because wasting ammunition saved American lives. His father listened in silence, occasionally nodding as the pieces of a terrible puzzle fell into place. The old man had worked in a munitions factory until the last months of the war, when there was no more steel to make bullets and no more workers to operate the machines. He understood what it meant for America to arm every soldier with weapons that Japanese factories could not even design, much less produce in useful numbers.
Years later, when Japan had rebuilt itself into an industrial power that could compete with America instead of fighting it, Tanaka would work in a factory that produced electronics for export to the United States. The precision and efficiency required to make transistor radios taught him the same lesson he had learned in that limestone cave on Okinawa. Wars were not won by individual courage or spiritual strength. They were won by the capacity to produce better tools faster than your enemy could adapt to them. He would tell his children about the M2 Carbine, not as a story of military defeat, but as a lesson about the power of innovation and industrial capacity. America had not won the war because its soldiers were braver or its cause was more just. America had won because its factories could imagine new ways to fight and then build those innovations quickly enough to matter. The carbine was just one example, but it represented everything that had made the difference between victory and defeat. In the end, Tanaka realized the real weapon had not been the M2 Carbine itself, but the industrial system that could create it, produce it in massive numbers, and get it into the hands of soldiers fighting on islands thousands of miles from home. That was the true power that Japan had challenged and lost to. That was the lesson worth remembering when the next generation asked how a war that seemed so certain could have ended in such complete defeat. The sound of automatic fire still echoed in his dreams, but it no longer frightened him. It reminded him of what was possible when human creativity was backed by industrial might, and why the future belonged to nations that could build better tools rather than just train braver soldiers.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.